In the mid-1960s, when American television was already broadcasting live rocket launches and Detroit was turning out cars that felt like rolling living rooms, there was a man in East Germany who spent his nights thinking about a very different kind of vehicle. He did not care how many cylinders it had or how smooth the ride was. He cared about one question: could he drive it straight through the most tightly controlled border in Europe and come out alive on the other side? His name, as people would later tell it in whispers and embellished stories, was Hans-Dieter Habeck. He was not a general, a spy, or a high-ranking party official. He was a truck driver. In a state that boasted about its tanks and missiles, he was one of the men who kept the everyday machinery of socialism running, hauling freight from factory to factory, from farm to warehouse, on roads lined with propaganda posters and patrol cars. By 1964, he had seen enough. He had watched as the wall went up in 1961, slicing Berlin in two and turning the inner German border into a death strip of barbed wire, anti-vehicle trenches, mines, and watchtowers. He knew people who had been arrested for trying to leave. He had heard rumors of others who had disappeared into prisons after being caught with forged documents, or shot in the attempt to swim rivers and canals. He also knew something else. Trucks still crossed the border. Every day at designated checkpoints, East German and Soviet vehicles passed through on official business: food, equipment, construction materials, sometimes even live animals moved from one tightly controlled zone to another. Guards checked manifests, stamped papers, and raised barriers. The entire system depended on a mixture of hardware and habit, concrete obstacles backed up by human routine. In the United States, engineers were using computers to simulate airflow around wings and to optimize loads for spacecraft. The moon landing was still a few years away, but the direction of travel was clear. Technology there was aimed at expanding horizons. In Hans-Dieter's world, technology was aimed at narrowing them. Sensors along fences, searchlights mounted on concrete towers, automatic firing devices wired to tripwires in the sand. Every new piece of hardware that appeared along the border was another reminder that his government trusted machines more than it trusted its own citizens. So he did what a good driver does when the road ahead is blocked. He started looking for another route. The idea took shape slowly at first. He knew the layout of the checkpoints from memory: the curves leading in, the positions of the concrete tank barriers, the line of metal poles set in the ground to stop vehicles from simply ramming through. He had seen the traffic patterns, the times when queues formed and when they thinned out. He had watched the guards, how they moved, how often they glanced at paperwork, how quickly they reacted when nothing out of the ordinary seemed to be happening. The more he watched, the more one thought nagged at him. For all the drills and doctrine, for all the Soviet-supplied equipment, the system at the barrier was still vulnerable to one thing: surprise. In East German television newsreels, border security was portrayed as a seamless machine. Everything was orderly, planned, under control. Guards spotted anomalies before they became problems. Hardware responded instantly. No one ever got through. In reality, human beings stood in the cold for hours at a time, their attention rising and falling with fatigue. Paperwork piled up, mechanical barriers sometimes jammed, and in that gap between propaganda and reality, Hans-Dieter saw his opening. He did not have access to Western-style computers, but he did have something like an internal model of the checkpoint in his head. He played through scenarios the way a chess player runs variations. What if he approached at shift change, when guards were distracted handing over duties? What if he timed his run to coincide with the arrival of a convoy, when everyone's focus would be split? What if he used not a light vehicle, which could be stopped easily, but a heavy truck that could smash through barriers before anyone had time to react? Slowly, the plan crystallized. He would find a way to load people into the back of his truck without attracting attention, men and women who were ready to risk their lives to reach the West. Some might be friends, others might be strangers whose names he would only learn in the dark as they climbed aboard. He would seal them in, drive towards the border as if on a legitimate delivery, and at the critical moment, instead of stopping at the barrier, he would accelerate, a head-on collision with the state.
On the day he chose, the sky was heavy with low clouds. The roads were damp. It was the kind of gray East German day that made the bright images on Western television sets, shiny American cars, aerial shots of cities, news anchors in well-lit studios, feel like transmissions from another planet. He checked the truck himself. He walked around it, feeling the stiffness of the suspension under the extra weight. He checked the locks on the back doors, where 7 people sat hidden, their hearts pounding with every sound. He glanced at the papers he would show if anyone stopped him before he reached the border, manifests stamped and signed, the right letterheads and names in the right places. Then he climbed into the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine caught, coughing once, then settling into a steady rumble. He pulled away from the safe anonymity of his starting point and pointed the truck toward the line that divided his world. In the cab, the instruments were simple: dials, switches, a speedometer, a fuel gauge. Nothing that would impress the visitors at a NASA control room, but for Hans Dieter, they were as critical as any flight panel. He watched the road and the needle on the speedometer with equal intensity, calculating the distances in his mind. Ahead, the checkpoint came into view. Concrete barriers, a swing arm painted red and white, a line of spikes embedded in the ground, small buildings with slit windows where border guards watched every vehicle that approached. He slowed as if preparing to stop, keeping his movements smooth. At that distance, the guards would see nothing unusual, just another East German truck coming in for inspection. One of them stepped forward from the hut, adjusting his cap, paperwork at the ready. Behind Hans Dieter, in the sealed cargo space, the 7 passengers sat in darkness. They could not see the barrier. They could only feel the change in the engine's tone as the truck decelerated, then felt a pause, then... Instead of the gentle braking of a routine stop, they felt a sudden surge. In the cab, Hans Dieter pushed the accelerator down. The engine roared, the truck lunged forward. The guard had maybe a second to process what was happening. He had been trained to check numbers, to scan faces, to spot forged stamps. He had not been trained to face a fully loaded truck bearing down on him at speed. Shouts, a frantic gesture, the barrier arm beginning to rise, or not. On either side, other guards reaching for their weapons, their instincts finally catching up with the reality forming in front of them. The impact was like a thunderclap. The truck slammed into the physical obstacles designed to stop tanks. Concrete cracked and shifted, metal buckled and bent. In the back, the fugitives were thrown sideways, hitting the walls and each other. For a moment, the world became nothing but noise and motion and the smell of fuel and dust. Then, impossibly, the truck kept going. It skidded, bounced, maybe even rode up on debris for a terrifying second, but its momentum carried it through the shattered remains of the barrier and out into the stretch of dominated space that lay beyond, into the sector where Western patrols drove, where Western law held, where the East German border police no longer had the right to give orders. In the rear, disoriented voices shouted questions. Are we alive? Are we through? Are we in the West?
Hans-Dieter fought the wheel, brought the truck under control, and forced it to a halt on the far side. His hands were trembling, his vision blurred at the edges, but through the windshield the signs were unmistakable. Western uniforms, Western vehicles, Western city beyond. When the back doors were finally opened, 7 people emerged from the wreckage, bruised, bloodied, but alive. They had shared a space no bigger than a small room, sealed off from the world, trusting that the man up front could calculate force and distance better than the men with guns behind them. For those watching from the western side, the scene was surreal. In a city where most crossings were regulated by checks and stamps, here was a vehicle that had simply refused to accept the rules. It had taken a piece of the border, one of the truck barricades the Eastern authorities had built to stop exactly this kind of thing, and turned it into a pile of broken concrete. To East German and Soviet planners, the border was supposed to be a technical solution to a political problem. If you built enough obstacles and layered enough technology, fences, mines, trenches, towers, you could turn the line on the map into something solid. You could make it impossible in a practical sense for people to leave without your permission. The escape of Hans-Dieter and his 7 passengers drove a literal hole through that assumption. From an American perspective, there is an obvious parallel. In the same decade, U.S. engineers were designing vehicles to punch through entirely different barriers: the sound barrier, the Van Allen belts, the gap between Earth and the Moon. Those projects relied on massive resources, sophisticated math, and cutting-edge technology. Hans-Dieter's project relied on something cruder but strangely similar: understanding mass, speed, and impact well enough to get exactly where he needed to go. He had to know not just how fast his truck could move, but what the structure in front of him could withstand. Too slow, and the barriers would stop him and turn the cab into a coffin. Too fast, and he might lose control completely, killing everyone aboard. In both cases, the flight to the moon and the dash through a border barricade, success depended on turning abstract equations into real-world action. The reaction on the eastern side was predictably furious. Internal reports, some of which would only surface years later, spoke of a serious breach of border security. Orders went out to reinforce vehicle barriers, to review guard protocols, to ensure that trucks could no longer build up that kind of speed near checkpoints. There were reprimands, inquiries, perhaps even quiet demotions. The message from above to those who stood at the gate was clear: you failed. You allowed one man and a truck to humiliate a system backed by one of the most powerful military machines on Earth. For East Germans hearing about the escape in rumors and carefully sanitized state media, the message was different. It said that even the most imposing border was not invincible. It said that if you combined courage with a good understanding of how the system worked, you could sometimes beat it.
In West Berlin, the story took on a life of its own. Newspapers reported on spectacular escapes by vehicle, from the man who drove through the wall in a stolen armored car, to families smuggled through the death strip in modified trucks and vans. Cartoonists drew images of the wall as a brittle shell, cracking under the impact of ordinary people who refused to stay in their assigned place. For American audiences following these stories from afar, they added another dimension to the way the Cold War was understood. It was not only about missiles and silos and spies in trench coats. It was about citizens who, when offered a choice between staying in a system that kept them in with guns and crossing into one that offered more freedom, chose to risk everything for the chance to cross. The East German regime was quick to highlight its own technological advances. It broadcast images of new industrial plants, rockets launched in cooperation with the Soviet Union, and the steady hum of its planned economy.
But stories like Hans Dieter's made a different point, that the most important technology is not the one you display at a parade, it is the one people use to change their own lives. From that angle, a truck used as a battering ram is not just a piece of machinery, it is a human-guided projectile aimed at the heart of a system that claimed to be unshakable. You can imagine how it must have felt to East German and Soviet officers who reviewed the incident on paper. They sat in offices lined with maps and diagrams of the border, convinced that their equations had accounted for every variable. They had calculated fields of fire, sight lines from watchtowers, the placement of obstacles to stop everything from lone pedestrians to armored vehicles. Then a report lands on their desk. On such and such a date, a driver accelerated his truck and crashed through the barricade, escaping with 7 passengers. All their diagrams suddenly have a hole in them. In the United States, analysts looked at the same kinds of reports and drew their own conclusions. They saw a system that had to constantly tighten its grip just to keep its own citizens in place. They saw that while the Soviet side talked about historical inevitability and the superiority of its model, people like Hans Dieter were voting with their wheels. Over time, the escapes added up. Vehicles packed with fugitives hidden in secret compartments, cars modified with false floors, refrigerated trucks where people rode among hanging carcasses to avoid detection. Each successful run forced the East German authorities to spend more resources on detection, more inspections, more dogs, more scanners. It was a technological arms race on a very small scale, unfolding meter by meter at checkpoints and border crossings. On one side, a state that progressively militarized a line on a map. On the other, individuals who adapted, improvised, and learned from each other's successes and failures. By the time the wall finally fell in 1989, the weight of those individual decisions had become impossible to ignore. Millions of East Germans had already left by other routes over the decades. Thousands had tried and failed. But the images that stuck in people's minds were the dramatic ones: balloons in the night sky, tunnels under the wall, ropes shot over no man's land, and trucks smashing through barricades. Today, when visitors come to Berlin and walk along the line where the wall once stood, they see plaques and exhibits about those escapes. They see photos of vehicles that defied the barrier, drawings of secret compartments, and quotes from people who risked and often lost everything in the effort. They also see something that would have seemed strange to a border guard in 1964. They see groups of American tourists, cameras in hand, listening intently as guides explain how ordinary Germans used mechanical ingenuity, borrowed ideas, and a deep desire for freedom to beat one of the most sophisticated control systems ever built. In that sense, the story of Hans-Dieter Habeck is not just about one truck and one crash. It is about the clash between two visions of what technology is for. In his world, the state used concrete, steel, and weapons to hold people in place. In the world he was trying to reach, people used steel and circuits and fuel to go farther than any humans had gone before. When he dropped his foot on the accelerator that day, he was doing more than driving. He was making a statement that no wall, however heavily engineered, could erase, that the desire to move, to choose, to cross boundaries is itself a kind of power, one that can turn even a cargo truck into a battering ram against an empire. And somewhere in the quiet after the crash, as he and his 7 passengers stood on Western soil catching their breath, the vast machinery of the Eastern Bloc took stock of what had just happened. A system backed by tanks, missiles, and Soviet science had been outmaneuvered by one man behind a steering wheel. For an American audience, that image resonates on several levels. It taps into the same emotional current that runs through stories of World War II tank duels and Cold War air battles. The idea that courage and ingenuity can outmatch brute force. It reinforces the notion that, in the long run, a society that invites people in will always have an advantage over one that has to build walls to keep them from leaving. The crash may have been loud and brief, just one episode in a long and complicated conflict, but its echo carries a simple message that in the war of ideas and systems that defined the 20th century, even a truck driver could become a kind of engineer, designing in one desperate sprint a path out of the shadow of the wall and into the light of a freer world.